In the golden haze of St. Mary's Mead, a hot air balloon soars above a vibrant festival, carrying wealthy Clarence Winthrop, a secretive guest, a disciplined pilot, and a nervous crew. But when the balloon lands, Winthrop is dead, poisoned by cyanide in his champagne, with a sabotaged fuel line hinting at a darker plot. As whispers of rivalry and betrayal swirl, Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and quiet wisdom, unravels a web of greed and vengeance. Who among the pilot, crew, guest, or a bitter rival slipped death into the glass? In this sky-high mystery, every clue points to a killer hiding in plain sight. Chapter 1. The Ascent. The village of St. Mary's Mead lay bathed in the soft amber glow of an October morning. Its thatched cottages and winding lanes stirring with an uncommon energy. The annual hot air balloon festival had arrived, transforming the usually tranquil fields of Meadowbank Hall into a vibrant tapestry of silks and wicker baskets. From her garden, Miss Jane Marple sat in her favourite wicker chair, a shawl draped over her shoulders against the crisp air. Her knitting needles moved with their familiar, unhurried rhythm, click, 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 as she observed the distant balloons rising like bright, buoyant jewels against the cloudless sky. Beside her, Lucy Eyles Barrow, her young and spirited neighbour, sipped tea and shared the morning's gossip with the enthusiasm of youth. Lucy, with her sharp mind and knack for uncovering secrets, had become a frequent companion to Miss Marple, who valued her insights as much as her company. "It's quite the spectacle, isn't it, Miss Marple?" Lucy said, her eyes following a balloon striped in crimson and gold. "The whole village is out there, gawking. But the real talk is about Mr. Clarence Winthrop. They say he's booked a private balloon ride this morning with Captain Harrow, the best balloonist in the county. And there's a crew, of course, 2 lads, I hear, and a mystery guest, a woman, no less. But no one seems to know who she is." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes, keen despite her years, flickered with interest. She adjusted her spectacles and tilted her head, the gesture as much a habit of thought as of necessity. "A mystery guest, you say?" Her voice was soft, almost absent, but Lucy knew better than to mistake it for disinterest. "And Mr. Winthrop, such a prominent man, choosing a private ascent with an unknown companion. That is suggestive." Lucy grinned, catching the glint in Miss Marple's gaze. "Oh, you're already spinning a tale, aren't you? I suppose it's just a fancy outing for a rich man, but the village is buzzing with speculation. Some say the guest is a relative. Others think she's a business associate. Mrs. Bantry swears it's something scandalous, but then she always does." Miss Marple's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Mrs. Bantry has a vivid imagination, my dear, but she is not always wrong. People do not go aloft in balloons for no reason, and Mr. Winthrop is not a man given to whims. A private ride with a select few. It reminds me of old Mrs. Hargreaves, who once hosted a private tea party for 3 and ended up solving a family feud and a theft before the scones were cold." Lucy laughed, setting her teacup down. "You and your village parallels. But I'll grant you, there's something odd about it. Winthrop's not exactly the adventurous sort. All that money from his textile empire, and he's more likely to be found in a boardroom than a balloon basket." "Precisely," Miss Marple said, her needles pausing briefly. "Which makes his choice all the more curious. And this Captain Harrow, reliable, you say?" "Oh, the best," Lucy replied. Ex-military, they say. Runs his balloon like a ship, all precision and discipline. The crew, though, Tom Bradley and Ned Foster, they're local boys, not much older than me. Tom's a bit jumpy, always fidgeting, but Ned's steady as a rock. They've been working the festival for years." Miss Marple nodded, filing away each detail as if tucking it into one of her neat knitting baskets. She glanced toward Meadowbank Hall, where the balloons were tethered in a meadow fringed with goldenrod and late-blooming asters. The crowd milled about, their voices carrying faintly on the breeze. Excited children, vendors hawking pies, and the occasional burst of laughter. Yet her thoughts lingered on Clarence Winthrop, a man whose wealth and ambition had made him a figure of note, even in a village as small as St. Mary's Mead. As the morning wore on, the festival's cheer was shattered by a sudden commotion. A boy on a bicycle sped down the lane, shouting for the doctor. Lucy, ever quick to act, darted to the gate to intercept him. "What's happened, Jimmy?" she called. "It's the balloon," the boy panted, his face flushed. "Mr. Winthrop's balloon. It came down in Higgs's field, not an hour after it went up. They're saying he's dead." Lucy's hand flew to her mouth, and she turned to Miss Marple, whose expression remained calm but alert, like a cat sensing movement in the grass. "Dead, you say?" Miss Marple murmured, setting her knitting aside. "That is most unfortunate, and most unexpected." She rose, smoothing her skirt, and reached for her walking stick. Not that she needed it, but it lent an air of harmlessness that often proved useful. "Come, Lucy," she said, "we must see what this is about. A death in a balloon is not a common occurrence, and I suspect there is more to this than a mere accident." As they made their way toward Higgs's field, the village hummed with whispers. Miss Marple's mind, sharp as ever, began to weave a pattern from the morning's fragments. A wealthy man, a private flight, a mysterious guest, and now a sudden death. She thought of a long-ago incident at a church fete, where a seemingly innocent game of cards had masked a bitter rivalry. "People," she said softly to Lucy, "are never quite what they seem, especially when they rise above the earth." Chapter 2. The Scene of the Crime. The meadow beyond Higgs's field, where the ill-fated balloon had come to rest, was a scene of quiet chaos by the time Miss Jane Marple and Lucy Eylis Barrow arrived. The autumn sun, now climbing toward its zenith, cast long shadows across the grass, where the crumpled form of the balloon's red and yellow canopy lay like a discarded shawl. The wicker basket, sturdy but tilted at an awkward angle, stood cordoned off by a makeshift barrier of ropes and stakes, guarded by a young constable who looked both nervous and out of his depth. A small crowd of villagers hovered at a respectful distance, their murmurs blending with the rustle of leaves stirred by a gentle breeze. Inspector Craddock, his brow furrowed and his notebook already open, was directing 2 officers to secure the area, while Dr. Haydock, the village physician, knelt beside a covered shape that could only be the late Clarence Winthrop. Miss Marple, her black handbag clutched primly, approached with the unhurried gait of an elderly spinster, though her eyes missed nothing. Lucy, at her side, carried a thermos of tea and a basket of scones, ostensibly for the hard-working officers, but in truth a pretext to gain access to the scene. The constable, recognizing Miss Marple as a fixture of St. Mary's Mead, hesitated only a moment before lifting the rope to let them pass. "Just don't touch anything, ma'am," he said, his voice betraying a mix of deference and unease. "Thank you, young man," Miss Marple replied, her tone as mild as milk. "We only wish to offer some refreshment. It's such a trying morning for you all." Inspector Craddock looked up from his notebook, his expression a blend of exasperation and reluctant fondness. "Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat, "I might have known you'd turn up. And Miss Ilis Barrow, too. I suppose you've heard the news?" "Indeed, Inspector," Miss Marple said, her pale blue eyes scanning the scene. "A most distressing event. Poor Mr. Winthrop. Might I ask what happened?" Craddock sighed, clearly weighing how much to share. He had learned, through past encounters, that Miss Marple's gentle inquiries often led to insights he could ill afford to ignore. "It's a grim business," he said, lowering his voice. "Winthrop was alive and well when the balloon took off, according to the pilot, Captain Harrow. About 40 minutes into the flight, he collapsed, clutched his chest, gasped, and was gone before they could land. Dr. Haydock suspects poison, though we're waiting for the coroner's report to confirm. No sign of a struggle, no obvious wounds, just death, sudden and unnatural." "Poison!" Lucy exclaimed, her eyes widening. She caught herself and lowered her voice, glancing at the villagers beyond the ropes. "In a balloon, of all places. That's awfully bold." "Bold, yes," Miss Marple murmured, her gaze drifting to the basket, "and precise. Poison requires both opportunity and intent, does it not, Inspector? And in a confined space, with so few present, the possibilities are limited." Craddock nodded, his expression grim. "Exactly. We've got 4 people to consider. Captain Harrow, the pilot, 2 crew members, Tom Bradley and Ned Foster, and a passenger, a Miss Vivian Duval. She claims she was a friend of Winthrop's, invited for the ride. They're all at the village hall now, giving statements. Harrow says the flight was smooth until Winthrop's collapse. The crew backs him up, say they were busy with their duties. Miss Duval claims she was chatting with Winthrop sipping champagne when he suddenly took ill." "Champagne," Miss Marple repeated, her voice soft but sharp. "A detail worth noting. And where is this champagne now?" Craddock gestured toward a small evidence table, where a constable was cataloguing items from the basket. Among them were 4 champagne flutes, one with a faint residue in its bowl, and an empty bottle, its label proclaiming a vintage Miss Marple recognized as exorbitantly expensive. "We're sending them to the lab," Craddock said. "If there's poison, it's likely in the glass or the bottle. But who administered it, and how, is the puzzle." Miss Marple stepped closer to the basket, her eyes tracing its woven contours, the ropes securing it, the burner now silent above. The canopy, though crumpled, showed no obvious signs of damage, but something about the scene struck her as incongruous. She thought of a long-ago incident in St. Mary's Mead, when a seemingly accidental spill at a tea party had masked a deliberate act of malice. "People," she said to Lucy, almost to herself, "are so very careless when they think themselves unobserved." Lucy, ever quick to follow Miss Marple's lead, leaned in. "You think someone tampered with something in the basket? But they were all up in the air together. Surely someone would have noticed." "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied, her tone thoughtful. "Or perhaps the act was done before the ascent, in a moment of distraction. Tell me, Lucy, what do we know of these people?" Lucy, who had a knack for gleaning village gossip, recounted what she'd heard. Captain Harrow, a former RAF officer, was a man of discipline and reputation, known for his meticulous handling of balloons, Tom Bradley, the younger crew member, was a local lad, eager but nervy, prone to fidgeting under pressure. Ned Foster, his counterpart, was steadier, a quiet sort who kept to himself but was reliable in his work. Miss Vivian Duval, the mysterious guest, was less known, a woman of elegance and reserve, rumoured to have some connection to Winthrop's past, though no one could say precisely what. "And then there's talk of a rival," Lucy added, lowering her voice. "Mr. Leonard Baxter, that textile magnate from London. He was at the festival yesterday, and there's no love lost between him and Winthrop. They say Baxter lost a big contract to Winthrop's company last month. He was seen near the balloons last night, though he claimed he was just admiring them." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with interest. "A rival, you say? That is most suggestive. Rivalry, like jealousy, can drive people to desperate acts. I recall a case in the village years ago when a grocer tampered with a rival's delivery van, all for a few extra customers. The lengths people go to for pride or profit." She trailed off, her attention drawn to the evidence table. The champagne flutes, now sealed in bags, caught her eye. One, she noted, had a smudge on its rim, as if someone had wiped it hastily. The bottle, too, bore a faint scratch near its cork, barely visible, but enough to pique her curiosity. She made a mental note to ask Craddock about it later. Dr. Haydock approached, wiping his hands on a handkerchief. "Miss Marple," he said with a nod of respect. "A bad business, this. I've seen my share of deaths, but this one's troubling. The symptoms, convulsions, cyanosis, a faint bitter almond smell, point to cyanide, or something like it. Fast-acting, deadly in small doses. He'd have been gone in minutes." "Cyanide," Miss Marple echoed, her mind racing. "A poison that leaves little room for error, and administered in the air, with only 4 others present. Tell me, Doctor, Haydock, how might such a poison be delivered?" Haydock considered this, his brow creasing. "In food or drink, most likely. The champagne's the obvious candidate, given they were all toasting, according to Harrow. But it could have been in something else. A sweet, perhaps, or even inhaled, though that's less likely in an open basket." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts turning to the logistics of a balloon flight. She had never been aloft herself, but she understood the basics. A small basket, a burner, a canopy, and a handful of people in close quarters. The act of poisoning would require both access and a moment's inattention. She pictured the scene. Winthrop, jovial with his champagne. Miss Duval, perhaps charming him with conversation. The crew, busy with ropes and burners. And Harrow, focused on the wind and altitude. A moment's distraction, a sleight of hand, it would be enough. "Inspector," she said, turning to Craddock, "might I see the basket itself?" "I understand its evidence, but an old woman's curiosity, you know." Craddock, accustomed to her ways, gave a wry smile. "Go ahead, Miss Marple, but don't disturb anything, and don't think I don't know what you're up to." She approached the basket, Lucy at her side, and peered inside. It was larger than she'd expected, with room for 5 or 6 people, though cramped. The floor was lined with a rubber mat, scuffed from use, and a small, wooden box held spare ropes and tools. A picnic hamper, presumably for the champagne and glasses, sat in one corner, its lid slightly ajar. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the hamper, then moved to the burner overhead, its metal gleaming dully in the sunlight. Something about the setup nagged at her, though she couldn't yet say what. "Lucy," she said quietly. "Do you recall who prepared the picnic hamper? Was it the crew or someone else?" Lucy frowned, thinking. "I heard Tom Bradley mention he and Ned set it up. Champagne, glasses, a few biscuits. But it was packed at Meadowbank Hall, so anyone could have had access before it was loaded." "Anyone," Miss Marple repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "That is the trouble with such cases. Opportunity is everywhere, but motive is particular." As they stepped back, Craddock joined them, his notebook now filled with scribbled notes. "We're taking statements from the others now," he said. "Harrow's a cool customer. Says he was at the controls the whole time, didn't see a thing. Tom's jumpy, keeps saying he poured the champagne, but swears the bottle was sealed. Ned's quieter, claims he was adjusting the burner when Winthrop collapsed. Miss Duval's shaken, but she's not saying much beyond calling Winthrop an old friend." Miss Marple's lips pursed. "An old friend," she said. "How convenient a phrase. People often use it to hide more complicated truths. I once knew a woman in St. Mary's Mead who called her cousin an old friend, until it came out they'd quarrelled over an inheritance. We must learn more about Miss Duval." Craddock raised an eyebrow. "You think she's hiding something?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that everyone hides something, Inspector. The trick is knowing what and why." She glanced back at the balloon, its canopy stirring slightly in the breeze. The festival, now subdued, continued in the distance, with children's laughter and the hum of a band playing a jaunty tune. Yet here, in this corner of the meadow, death had cast its shadow. Miss Marple thought of another case, years ago, when a poisoned cake at a village fete had nearly gone unnoticed because everyone was distracted by a raffle. "The simplest settings," she murmured to Lucy, "are often the most deceptive." Lucy, catching her tone, leaned closer. "You're already piecing it together, aren't you? What do you think happened?" "I think," Miss Marple said, her eyes narrowing, "that Mr. Winthrop's death was no accident, and the answer lies not in the sky, but in the hearts of those who flew with him. We must watch, Lucy, and listen. People reveal themselves in the smallest ways, a glance, a hesitation, a smudge on a glass." As they turned to leave, Miss Marple paused, her gaze lingering on the evidence table. The champagne flute with the residue seemed to beckon, its secret locked within its fragile curve. She made a mental note to inquire about the bottle's cork and whether anyone had examined it closely. For now, she and Lucy would return to the village, where tea and gossip might yield more clues than the meadow itself. "Inspector," she called softly, "do keep us informed, won't you?" An old woman likes to feel useful, even in such sad times. Craddock chuckled, shaking his head. "I'll keep you posted, Miss Marple, but don't go solving this before I do." She smiled, a twinkle in her eye, and walked away with Lucy, her mind already spinning a web of possibilities. The balloon, the poison, the rival, the guest, each was a thread, and Miss Marple knew, with the certainty of long experience, that she would soon find where they converged. Chapter 3. The Suspects. The village hall of St. Mary's Mead, a sturdy building of weathered stone, hummed with a subdued tension as Miss Jane Marple and Lucy Islesbarrow entered its oak-panelled interior. The hall, usually reserved for flower shows and parish meetings, had been commandeered by Inspector Craddock as a makeshift headquarters for the investigation into Clarence Winthrop's death. A constable stood at the door, his notebook open, while inside, the 4 individuals present during the fatal balloon ride sat in separate corners. their faces etched with varying degrees of unease. Miss Marple, her black handbag clasped in her gloved hands, moved with the unassuming grace of an elderly spinster, her eyes darting from one suspect to another, cataloguing their postures, their glances, their silences. Lucy, ever her ally in observation, whispered, "They look like a flock of nervous hens, don't they? Not one of them seems keen to talk." Miss Marple's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Nervousness, my dear Lucy, is often a sign of something hidden. Not always guilt, but certainly something. I recall a young curate in St. Mary's Mead who fidgeted dreadfully during a sermon, only to confess later he'd misplaced the vicar's best pen. Let us see what these four reveal." She settled onto a wooden bench near the hearth, where a small fire crackled, casting flickering shadows across the room. Inspector Craddock, standing at a table strewn with papers, glanced up and nodded, accustomed by now to Miss Marple's presence at such moments. "Miss Marple, Miss Iles-Barrow," he said, his tone a mix of resignation and respect. "We're just finishing initial statements. You're welcome to listen, but I'll ask you to keep questions for later." "Of course, Inspector," Miss Marple replied, her voice as mild as a summer breeze. She adjusted her shawl and opened her knitting bag, drawing out a half-finished scarf. The needles began their rhythmic click, a sound that seemed to blend into the background, rendering her all but invisible to those unaccustomed to her ways. First to speak was Captain James Harrow, the pilot, a man whose erect bearing and weathered features spoke of a life spent in command. His grey hair was cropped close, and his eyes, sharp as a hawk's, surveyed the room with a cool detachment. He stood as he spoke, addressing Craddock with the precision of a military report. "The flight began at precisely 9 o'clock, he said, his voice steady. Mr. Winthrop was in good spirits, as was Miss Duval. I was at the controls, monitoring the wind and altitude. The crew, Bradley and Foster, handled the burner and ropes. We were at about 2,000 feet when Winthrop took a sip of champagne, chatted briefly with Miss Duval, then suddenly clutched his chest and collapsed. I brought the balloon down as quickly as I could, but he was gone before we touched the ground." Miss Marple's needles paused for a fraction of a second. "Champagne again," she murmured to Lucy, so softly only her companion could hear. "And at 2,000 feet, with all eyes supposedly elsewhere. A bold moment for a poisoner." Craddock, noting Harrow's account, pressed further. "You saw nothing unusual? No one tampering with the glass or bottle?" Harrow's jaw tightened. "Nothing. My focus was on the balloon. I trusted the crew to handle the refreshments, as they've done dozens of times. The bottle was sealed when we boarded. I saw Bradley open it myself." Miss Marple's eyes flicked to Tom Bradley, seated on a folding chair near the window. The young man, no more than 22, had the lanky frame of youth not yet settled into manhood. His hands twisted in his lap, and his eyes darted toward the door as if longing to escape. When Craddock called him forward, his voice cracked slightly. "I poured the champagne, sir, like Captain Harrow said. The bottle was sealed, I swear it. I handed a glass to Mr. Winthrop, one to Miss Duval, and one each to me and Ned. Captain Harrow doesn't drink on duty. I didn't see nothing odd. Mr. Winthrop was laughing, talking about the view, and then he just fell. Did you touch his glass after you handed it to him?" Craddock asked, his pencil poised. Tom's face flushed. "No, sir. I was busy with the ropes after that. Ned was at the burner. And Miss Duval was, well, she was talking to Mr. Winthrop. I didn't see nothing else." Miss Marple noted the boy's unease, the way his fingers plucked at his sleeve. She thought of a village shop boy who, years ago, had stammered just so when questioned about a missing jar of sweets. Nervousness could mean guilt, or merely fear of being blamed. She made a mental note to observe Tom further. Ned Foster, the other crew member, was next. Stockier than Tom, with a square jaw and a calm demeanour, he spoke with a measured tone that contrasted with his colleague's agitation. "I was at the burner most of the time," he said, meeting Craddock's gaze steadily. "It takes focus to keep the balloon stable, especially with the morning winds. I saw Mr. Winthrop take a drink, and I heard him talking with Miss Duval. Next thing I knew, he was on the floor of the basket. I helped Captain Harrow bring us down, but there wasn't much we could do." "And the champagne?" Craddock pressed. "Did you handle it?" "Only to pass the bottle to Tom," Ned replied. "It was sealed, like he said. I didn't touch the glasses after they were poured." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, but her mind was elsewhere. Ned's calm was almost too perfect, she thought, like the village carpenter who once claimed ignorance of a broken gate, only to be found later with the tools that matched the damage. She glanced at his hands, noting a faint stain on his cuff. Oil, perhaps from the burner, or something else entirely. Last came Miss Vivian Duval, who rose from her chair with the grace of a woman accustomed to being watched. Her dark hair was swept into an elegant chignon, and her tailored coat, though practical for a balloon ride, hinted at wealth and taste. Her face, however, was pale, and her eyes held a guarded quality that Miss Marple found instantly intriguing. "I was a guest of Mr. Winthrop's," she said, her voice low but clear. "We were old acquaintances, and he invited me to join him for the festival. We were enjoying the flight, sipping champagne, talking of old times. Then he gasped, fell, and it was over so quickly. I was shocked, Inspector. I still am." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "Old acquaintances, you say? How well did you know Mr. Winthrop?" Miss Duval hesitated, her fingers tightening on her handbag. "We met years ago in London. Business circles, you know. We hadn't seen each other in some time, but he thought I'd enjoy the balloon ride. That's all." Miss Marple's needles slowed. The phrase, "old acquaintances," struck her as deliberately vague, much like the excuses of a certain widow in St. Mary's Mead who claimed a distant connection to a man later revealed as her former suitor. Miss Duval's composure, she noted, was a mask, one that slipped ever so slightly when Winthrop's name was mentioned. As the statements concluded, Craddock dismissed the group with instructions to remain in the village for further questioning. Miss Marple and Lucy stepped outside, where the autumn air carried the faint scent of wood smoke from the festival grounds. Lucy, her eyes bright with curiosity, turned to her companion. "Well, what do you make of them? Harrow's all business, Tom's a bundle of nerves, Ned's too calm, and Miss Duval, she's hiding something, isn't she?" Miss Marple nodded, her gaze distant. "They are a varied lot, Lucy, and each has a role in this puzzle. Captain Harrow's discipline makes him unlikely to act rashly, but discipline can hide calculation. Tom's nervousness may be innocence or fear of discovery. Ned's calm is reassuring, yet I wonder if it conceals more than it reveals. And Miss Duval, her reticence suggests a history with Mr. Winthrop that goes beyond mere acquaintance." Lucy frowned. "But what about this Leonard Baxter everyone's whispering about? The rival?" I heard at the pub that he was furious with Winthrop over some business deal. Could he have something to do with this?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "A rival is always a person of interest, my dear. I recall a case in the village where a farmer poisoned a neighbour's well over a disputed patch of land. Motive, Lucy, is the key, and Mr. Baxter's resentment may well be the thread that unravels this knot. We must learn more about him, and about what passed in that basket before Mr. Winthrop met his end." As they walked back toward Miss Marple's cottage, the village hall receding behind them, the older woman's mind was already at work sifting through the morning's observations. The champagne, the sealed bottle, the smudge on the glass, the stain on Ned's cuff. Each was a fragment, like the pieces of a quilt she might stitch together. She thought of a long-ago garden party, where a poisoned cordial had gone unnoticed until a sharp-eyed guest remarked on a bitter taste. "The truth," she said softly to Lucy, "is often in the details we overlook. We must keep watching and listening, for the smallest slip may tell us everything." Lucy grinned, undeterred by the gravity of the moment. "You're already halfway to solving it, aren't you? I'll see what I can dig up about Baxter and Miss Duval. The village is full of tongues wagging about this." "Do that, my dear," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but firm. "And while you're at it, keep an eye on young Tom. Nervous boys often know more than they say." With that, they parted. Lucy to her inquiries, and Miss Marple to her cottage, where she would sit by the fire and let her mind weave the threads of suspicion into a pattern only she could yet see. Chapter 4. The Poisoned Glass. The afternoon sun filtered through the leaded windows of Meadowbank Hall, casting dappled patterns across the polished oak floor where Miss Jane Marple stood, her small figure, dwarfed by the grandeur of the old estate. The hall, home to the widowed Lady Bantry, was a hub of activity, as festival organisers tidied up and villagers lingered, eager for news of the morning's tragedy. Miss Marple had come under the guise of delivering a jar of her homemade damson jam to Lady Bantry. But her true purpose was to examine the balloon's equipment, now stored in a side room under police supervision. Lucy Eilers Barrow, ever her resourceful companion, had arranged access through a discreet word with Mr. Higgs, the estate's caretaker, who was only too happy to oblige the village's beloved spinster. "Such a dreadful business," Lady Bantry exclaimed, bustling into the room with a tray of tea things. Her round face, usually alight with cheer, was clouded with concern. "Poor Mr. Winthrop, dead in a balloon of all places. And poison, they say. It's like something out of a novel, Missy Marple. What do you make of it?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "It is indeed a puzzle, Dolly," she said, using Lady Bantry's familiar name. "But puzzles, you know, have a way of unravelling when one tugs at the right thread. I thought I might have a look at the balloon's basket, if Mr. Higgs permits. An old woman's curiosity, nothing more." Lady Bantry chuckled, though her eyes were wary. "Curiosity, indeed. I know you better than that, Jane. You're already sniffing out clues, aren't you? Well, go on. Higgs is in the back room. But do tell me if you find anything scandalous." With Lucy at her side, Miss Marple made her way to the storage room, where the wicker basket and its folded canopy were guarded by a young constable. Mr. Higgs, a wiry man with a face like weathered leather, greeted them with a nod. "Inspector Craddock said you might have a look, Miss Marple," he said, scratching his chin. "But mind you don't touch nothing. Evidence, you know." "Of course, Mr. Higgs," Miss Marple replied, her voice as soothing as a lullaby. "I only wish to understand how such a tragedy could occur." The basket, still tilted slightly from its rough landing, stood in the centre of the room, surrounded by coils of rope and the deflated canopy. Nearby, on a trestle table, lay the items collected as evidence: 4 champagne flutes, the empty bottle, a small picnic hamper, and a few tools used by the crew. Miss Marple's gaze settled on the flutes, one of which bore a faint cloudy residue in its bowl. She leaned closer, careful not to disturb it, and noted a slight irregularity on its rim, a smudge, as if someone had wiped it hastily. The bottle, too, caught her attention. Its cork, now bagged separately, had a faint scratch near its edge, barely noticeable, but suggestive of tampering. Lucy, following her gaze, whispered, "That glass looks suspicious, doesn't it?" "And the bottle? Do you think the poison was in there?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple murmured, her mind already turning over possibilities. "But poison is a delicate matter, Lucy. It requires not just access, but timing. And in a balloon, with all eyes so close, the act must have been swift and subtle." Mr. Higgs, hovering nearby, offered a tidbit. "I saw that bottle being loaded myself, Miss Marple. Tom Bradley brought it from the hall's kitchen, said it was a special vintage Mr. Winthrop requested. Sealed, it was, or so he claimed." Miss Marple's lips pursed. "Sealed, you say? And yet seals can be broken and resealed, Mr. Higgs, by those who know how. I recall a case in St. Mary's Mead where a bottle of elderberry wine was tampered with at a church fete. No one suspected until the vicar's wife remarked on a strange taste. Before they could explore further, Inspector Craddock arrived, accompanied by Dr. Haydock, whose grave expression confirmed the gravity of their findings. "Miss Marple," Craddock said, with a hint of exasperation, "I should have known you'd be here. Have you seen something I haven't?" "Not at all, Inspector," she replied, her tone demure. "I am merely observing, but I wonder, has Dr. Haydock confirmed the poison?" Haydock nodded, his hands clasped behind his back. "Cyanide, almost certainly. The autopsy's preliminary results came in an hour ago. Fast-acting, lethal in a small dose. It was in the champagne, we think, based on the residue in one glass. Winthrop's symptoms, convulsions, cyanosis, the faint smell of bitter almonds are unmistakable." "Cyanide," Miss Marple repeated, her voice soft but sharp. "A choice both bold and cruel. And delivered, it seems, through a single glass. But how, Doctor? Haydock, could one glass be poisoned without risking the others?" Haydock considered this, his brow furrowing. "It's possible the poison was added to the glass itself, not the bottle. A drop or two, smeared on the rim or mixed with the champagne after pouring. The others drank without issue, so it wasn't in the bottle's contents." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Then we must consider who handled that glass, and when. Tom Bradley poured the champagne, did he not? And Miss Duval was closest to Mr. Winthrop during the flight." Craddock scribbled a note. "We're testing all the glasses, and the bottle for fingerprints and residue. But it's a devil of a thing. 4 people in a basket, and no one saw anything amiss." "People see what they expect to see, Inspector," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking as she resumed her knitting, a habit that seemed to steady her thoughts. "And in a balloon, with the excitement of the ascent, a moment's inattention would be enough. I recall a young lady in the village who dropped a poisoned sweet into a tea tray while everyone was distracted by a dog chasing a cat. The simplest moments are often the most dangerous. Lucy, ever alert, pointed to the picnic hamper. "What about this? Could someone have tampered with it before the flight? It was in the hall's kitchen, wasn't it?" Higgs nodded. "Aye, it was packed there. I saw Tom and Ned fussing over it, but the kitchen's a busy place. Anyone could have slipped in." Miss Marple's mind turned to the kitchen staff, the festival workers, and the mysterious Leonard Baxter, whose name kept surfacing in village gossip. She thought of a long-ago incident where a jar of preserves, left unattended at a fete, had been laced with something far less innocent than sugar. "Opportunity," she murmured to Lucy, "is a door left ajar. We must learn who passed through it." As they stepped away from the basket, Lady Bantry reappeared, her curiosity unabated. "Jane, you must tell me what you found. Is it the pilot, or that mysterious woman? I've heard she's not what she seems." Miss Marple smiled, deflecting with her usual tact. "I've found nothing yet, Dolly, but I'm sure the inspector will get to the bottom of it. We mustn't jump to conclusions." But in her mind, the pieces were beginning to align. The poisoned glass, the scratched cork, the nervous crew, the guarded guest. Each was a clue, a fragment of a larger pattern. She thought of Captain Harrow's steady demeanour, Tom's twitching hands, Ned's calm facade, and Miss Duval's carefully chosen words. And then there was Baxter, the rival, whose shadow loomed over the case like a storm cloud. "Lucy," she said as they left the hall, "we must pay a visit to the village inn tonight. The crew often gathers there, and tongues loosen over a pint. And perhaps you might inquire about Mr. Baxter's movements yesterday. A man with a grudge is rarely idle." Lucy grinned, her eyes alight with the thrill of the chase. "I'll get right on it, but you're already ahead of me, aren't you? You've got that look, the one that says you're seeing something we're all missing." Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. "I see only what is there, my dear, but sometimes that is enough." As they walked back through the village, the festival's music drifting faintly on the breeze, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the poisoned glass. It was the heart of the mystery she felt, a single deadly vessel that had carried Clarence Winthrop to his doom. And somewhere, in the actions of those who shared that balloon, lay the truth, waiting to be uncovered by a mind as patient and precise as her own. Chapter 5. The rival's shadow, the Golden Boar, the sole inn of St. Mary's Mead, glowed warmly in the gathering dusk, its mullioned windows casting pools of light onto the cobbled street. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of ale and wood smoke, and the low hum of conversation filled the taproom. Miss Jane Marple, seated at a corner table with a pot of tea and her ever-present knitting, appeared to all the world as a harmless old lady enjoying a quiet evening. Lucy Eilers Barrow, her sharp-eyed companion, sat opposite, her youthful energy tempered by the task at hand, to glean what the village knew of Leonard Baxter, the man whose name had surfaced as Clarence Winthrop's bitter rival. The inn was a natural gathering place for festival workers and locals alike, and tonight it buzzed with talk of the morning's tragedy. Miss Marple's ears, attuned to the nuances of village gossip, caught snatches of speculation, some wild, some plausible, all tinged with the shock of sudden death. She sipped her tea, her needles clicking softly as Lucy leaned forward, her voice low. "I've been asking around as you suggested," Lucy said. "The barmaid, Elsie, says Baxter was here last night, drinking alone and looking sour. He left just before closing, carrying a satchel. Nobody thought much of it. He's been at the festival before. But it's odd, don't you think? Miss Marple's eyes gleamed behind her spectacles. Very odd, Lucy. A man with a satchel lingering near the balloons, as Mr. Higgs mentioned. I recall a case in the village where a travelling salesman, quite respectable, was seen with a bag that later held stolen silver. Small details, my dear, often hide large truths. Lucy nodded, her curiosity piqued. Elsie also said Baxter was muttering about Winthrop, something about stealing what's rightfully mine. Sounds like bad blood, doesn't it? Indeed, Miss Marple murmured, her mind drifting to a long-ago quarrel in St. Mary's Mead, where a farmer's grudge over a disputed field led to a sabotage plough. Resentment festers, Lucy, and men like Mr. Baxter, when wronged, rarely forget. We must learn more about this contract he lost to Winthrop. As if summoned by their words, the inn's door swung open, admitting a man whose broad shoulders and confident stride marked him as an outsider to the village's quiet rhythms. Leonard Baxter, in his early 50s, had the polished look of a city businessman. Tailored coat, gold watch chain, and a face that might have been handsome, but for the hardness in his eyes. He ordered a whiskey at the bar, his voice carrying a trace of irritation, and settled at a table near the fire, unaware of the two women watching him. Miss Marple's needles paused as she studied him. His movements were deliberate, but there was a tension in his jaw, a restlessness in the way he tapped his fingers against his glass. A man with much on his mind, she said softly to Lucy. And not all of it pleasant, I think. Lucy, ever bold, seized the opportunity. I'll have a word with Elsie, she whispered, rising with the ease of one accustomed to blending into any crowd. She approached the bar, engaging the barmaid in light conversation about the festival, her questions deftly steering toward Baxter. Miss Marple watched, her expression serene but her mind alert, as Lucy returned with fresh intelligence. Elsie says Baxter's been coming to the festival for years, but this time he was different. Angry, distracted, Lucy reported, sliding back into her seat. She overheard him talking to a man in a tweed cap last night, someone she didn't recognize. Baxter said something about making things right, and mentioned Winthrop by name. Elsie thought it was just business talk, but now she's not so sure. Miss Marple's lips pursed. A man in a tweed cap, you say? That is most interesting. And making things right is a phrase that can cover many sins. We must find out who this stranger was, Lucy. A rival does not act alone unless he is desperate, or very clever. The inn's door opened again, admitting Mr. Higgs, the caretaker from Meadowbank Hall. His weathered face brightened at the sight of Miss Marple, and he ambled over, cap in hand. "Evening, Miss Marple, Miss Isla's Barrow," he said, his voice rough but warm. "Thought I'd find you here. The village is fair buzzing about poor Mr. Winthrop." "Indeed, Mr. Higgs," Miss Marple replied, offering him a seat. "A sad affair. You were at the balloon sight last night, were you not? I believe you mentioned seeing Mr. Baxter there." Higgs nodded, settling into the chair with a creak. I did. He was near the balloons, just after dusk. Had a satchel with him, like I told you. Said he was admiring the craftsmanship, but he didn't linger long. Looked to me like he was checking something, though I couldn't say what. I thought it queer, him being there so late, but he's a big name, so I didn't question it. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Queer indeed. And did you notice anyone else near the balloons? A man in a tweed cap, perhaps? Higgs frowned, scratching his chin. Now you mention it, there was a fellow like that, hanging about near the tents. Didn't get a good look at him. Kept his head down. Moved quick. Could have been talking to Baxter, but I was too far to hear." Lucy leaned forward, her voice eager but low. "Did Baxter touch the balloon? The ropes? The basket? Anything?" "Not that I saw," Higgs said, "but it was getting dark, and I was busy locking up the hall. He could have done something, I suppose. That balloon, Captain Harrow's pride and joy, was all set for the morning's flight. Nobody was supposed to be near it." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, but her mind was elsewhere. She thought of a village gardener who, years ago, had tampered with a neighbour's prize roses out of spite, his actions unnoticed because he chose the cover of twilight. "Darkness," she said softly, "is a great friend to those with secrets. And a satchel, Mr. Higgs, can hold many things, tools perhaps, or something more sinister." Higgs's eyes widened. "You think Baxter had a hand in this? Poison, they're saying. But could he have got to the champagne?" "That," Miss Marple said, "is what we must discover. The poison was in Mr. Winthrop's glass, Dr. Haydock says. But how it got there is the question. A man like Mr. Baxter with a grudge might find a way, if not to the glass, then to the bottle, or even the balloon itself." Lucy's brow furrowed. "The balloon? You think he tampered with more than the champagne?" "It is possible," Miss Marple replied, her voice thoughtful. "A rival's anger can take many forms. I recall a case where a man sabotaged a rival's cart, hoping for an accident, only to find his plan had unexpected consequences. We must keep our minds open, Lucy." As Higgs excused himself to fetch a pint, Miss Marple's gaze returned to Baxter, who was now deep in conversation with a local farmer, his voice low but intense. She noted the way he glanced around, as if wary of being overheard, and the slight tremor in his hand as he lifted his glass. "A man under strain," she murmured. "And strain, Lucy, often betrays intent." Lucy, following her gaze, nodded. "I'll see if I can find out more about this Tweedcap fellow. Maybe someone at the festival saw him up close. And I'll check with the kitchen staff at Meadowbank Hall. See if Baxter was anywhere near the hamper before it was loaded." "Do that," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but firm. "And keep an ear out for anything about Miss Duval, too. Her connection to Winthrop is more than she admits, I'm sure. People with secrets, Lucy, leave traces, like footprints in the dew." As the evening wore on, the inn grew noisier, the crowd swelling with festival stragglers and locals seeking respite from the day's shocks. Miss Marple, her tea long since cold, continued her knitting, her eyes and ears open to the currents of the room. Baxter's presence, Higgs's tale, and the shadowy figure in the tweed cap formed a new pattern in her mind, one that pointed to a motive rooted in rivalry and revenge. She thought of the poisoned glass, the scratched cork, and the balloon's silent descent, each a piece of a puzzle that grew more intricate by the hour. "Lucy," she said at last as they prepared to leave, "we are dealing with a mind that plans carefully but acts boldly. Mr. Baxter's shadow looms large, but we must not overlook the others. A single glass poisoned, a balloon tampered with. Someone took great risks, and risks, my dear, are never taken without reason." Lucy grinned, undaunted by the complexity. "You're closing in, aren't you?" "I can tell. I'll dig deeper tomorrow. Baxter, the Tweedcap man, the lot." Miss Marple smiled, her expression serene, but her mind as sharp as the needles in her hands. "Do that, my dear. And while you do, I shall sit by my fire and think. The truth, you know, often comes to those who wait and watch." As they stepped into the cool night air, the inn's lights fading behind them, Miss Marple felt the weight of the mystery settle over her. The rival's shadow was long, but it was only one thread in the tapestry of Clarence Winthrop's death. Somewhere, in the interplay of motive and opportunity, lay the key, and she was determined to find it. Chapter 6. The Guest's Secret. The drawing-room of Meadowbank Hall was a study in faded elegance, its high ceilings and velvet drapes softened by the glow of a single chandelier. Lady Bantry, ever the gracious hostess, had invited Miss Jane Marple and Lucy Iles-Barrow to an impromptu tea-party, ostensibly to discuss the Balloon Festival's charitable proceeds, but, in truth, to indulge in the village's latest obsession, the death of Clarence Winthrop. The room buzzed with the chatter of local ladies, their voices a delicate counterpoint to the clink of porcelain and the rustle of silk. Among them sat Miss Vivian Duval, the enigmatic guest from the fatal balloon ride. Her poised demeanour a stark contrast to the animated gossip around her. Miss Marple, seated in a cushioned armchair near the fire, sipped her tea with the air of one entirely at ease, though her pale blue eyes missed nothing. Her knitting lay in her lap, a prop as much as a pastime, its rhythmic click blending into the background like a metronome of thought. Lucy, stationed near the tea tray, played the part of a helpful assistant, pouring cups and passing scones while keeping a sharp eye on Miss Duval. The younger woman's knack for blending into any setting made her the perfect observer, and Miss Marple relied on her to catch what might escape even her own keen gaze. "Dolly, you've outdone yourself with these scones," Miss Marple said, her voice mild as she addressed Lady Bantry. "But I confess, my thoughts keep straying to poor Mr. Winthrop. Such a tragedy, and in our little village." Lady Bantry, her round face alight with the thrill of scandal, leaned forward. "Isn't it dreadful, Jane? Poison, they say, right up there in the sky. And Miss Duval here was with him. Oh, do tell us, Miss Duval, what was it like? You must have been terrified." Miss Duval, seated on a brocade sofa, set her teacup down with a faint clink. Her dark eyes, framed by lashes that seemed almost too perfect, met Lady Bantry's with a practised calm. "It was quite shocking, Lady Bantry," she said, her voice low and measured. "Clarence, Mr. Winthrop, was in high spirits, enjoying the view, when he suddenly collapsed. It happened so quickly, there was nothing any of us could do." Miss Marple's needles paused, though her expression remained serene. "How distressing it must have been," she said, her tone all sympathy. "You knew Mr. Winthrop well, I understand. An old friend, you said." Miss Duval's fingers tightened briefly on her saucer, a movement so subtle it might have gone unnoticed by anyone but Miss Marple. "Yes, an old friend," she replied, her gaze steady but guarded. "We met in London some years ago, through mutual acquaintances. He was kind enough to invite me to the festival, knowing my fondness for such events." "Mutual acquaintances," Miss Marple echoed, her voice as soft as a whisper. "How pleasant to renew such connections. I recall a lady in St. Mary's Mead who spoke of an old friend at a garden party, only to reveal later they'd shared a rather complicated history. People are so interesting, aren't they?" Miss Duval's smile was tight, and she turned her attention to her tea, effectively closing the subject. Miss Marple noted the evasion, her mind filing it away like a scrap of fabric for a quilt. She thought of a village seamstress who once hid a bitter feud behind polite smiles. her true feelings betrayed only by a tremble in her voice. Miss Duval, she suspected, was hiding more than a casual acquaintance with Clarence Winthrop. Lucy, seizing the moment, approached Miss Duval with a plate of biscuits. "You must have seen so much of the world, Miss Duval," she said, her tone bright and disarming. "London, business circles. Did you work with Mr. Winthrop, perhaps? Here he was quite the titan in textiles." Miss Duval hesitated, her eyes flicking to Lucy with a hint of wariness. "Not directly," she said. "We crossed paths in business matters, but I'm no longer in that world. I prefer quieter pursuits now." Lucy's smile was all innocence, but her question had struck a chord. As she returned to Miss Marple's side, she whispered, "She's cagey, isn't she?" "I bet there's more to her and Winthrop than she's letting on." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, her needles resuming their rhythm. "A woman who chooses her words so carefully has something to protect. We must learn what it is." The tea party continued, with Lady Bantry regaling her guests with tales of past festivals, but Miss Marple's attention remained on Miss Duval. The woman's elegance was undeniable. Her tailored dress, the pearl brooch at her throat, the way she held her teacup with a delicate precision. But there was a brittleness to her composure, like porcelain that might crack under pressure. Miss Marple thought of a young widow in St. Mary's Mead, who had presented a similar facade, only to be undone by a single careless remark about a lost inheritance. As the afternoon waned, Lucy excused herself under the pretext of fetching more hot water, slipping instead into the village to pursue a lead she'd uncovered earlier. At the post office, she'd overheard Mrs. Muggle, the postmistress, mention a letter addressed to Miss Duval that had arrived weeks ago, bearing a London postmark and a crest that suggested a connection to Winthrop's company. Lucy, with her knack for charming information from even the most tight-lipped, persuaded Mrs. Muggle to share more over a cup of tea. "It was a business letter, or so it looked," Mrs. Muggle confided, her eyes gleaming with the joy of imparting gossip. "Addressed to Miss Vivian Duval, care of the inn, but the crest was Winthrop Textiles, plain as day. I thought it odd, her being just a visitor, but she collected it herself and didn't say a word." Lucy's pulse quickened. "Did you see what was in it, or who sent it?" Mrs. Muggle shook her head. "Not my place to pry, dear, though I'll admit I was curious. It was thick, mind you, not just a note, and Miss Duval looked pale when she took it, like she wasn't expecting it." Armed with this tidbit, Lucy returned to Meadowbank Hall just as the tea party was dispersing. She found Miss Marple in the garden, strolling among the late roses, her shawl drawn tight against the evening chill. "You were right about Miss Duval," Lucy said, her voice low with excitement. "She got a letter from Winthrop's company a few weeks ago, and it shook her. Mrs. Muggle said it was substantial, not just a casual note." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "A letter, you say? That is most suggestive, Lucy. I recall a case where a single letter sent in haste revealed a motive for murder. We must find out what tied Miss Duval to Winthrop's business, and why she conceals it." Lucy nodded, her mind racing. "I'll see if I can dig deeper, maybe check with the innkeeper about her stay, or if she's had other visitors. But what do you think it means? Was she angry with Winthrop? Enough to, you know?" Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. "Anger, betrayal, loss, these are powerful motives, Lucy. If Miss Duval was wronged by Winthrop, perhaps in business she might have harboured a grudge, and a grudge in a confined space like a balloon can be deadly. But we must not leap to conclusions. The letter may be a clue, or it may be nothing. We need more. As they walked back toward the village, the sky darkening to a deep indigo, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the poisoned glass and the scratched cork, now joined by the mystery of Miss Duval's letter. She pictured the balloon's ascent, the clink of champagne flutes, and the moment when Winthrop's laughter turned to agony. Miss Duval, seated closest to him, would have had opportunity, perhaps to slip something into his glass during a moment of distraction. But motive remained elusive, and Miss Marple knew better than to assume without evidence. "Lucy," she said at last, "we must also consider Mr. Baxter. His rivalry with Winthrop is clear, but Miss Duval's secret may intertwine with it. People's lives, you know, are like threads in a tapestry. Pull one, and others unravel. We must keep watching and listening." Lucy grinned, undeterred by the complexity. "I'll get to the bottom of that letter, and I'll keep an eye on Baxter. You're building the picture, aren't you? I can tell." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes fixed on the distant lights of the village. "I am only gathering threads, my dear. But soon I think we shall see the pattern clearly." As they reached her cottage, the night air cool and still, Miss Marple felt the weight of the mystery deepen. The guest's secret was a new piece in the puzzle, one that hinted at a past fraught with ambition and betrayal. And somewhere, in the interplay of those who shared that balloon, lay the truth, waiting for her patient, unerring hand to uncover it. Chapter 7. The crew's alibi. The St. Mary's Mead Police Station, a modest brick building nestled between the village green and the baker's shop, was a hive of quiet activity as the investigation into Clarence Winthrop's death pressed into its second day. The morning light streamed through a high window, illuminating a small room where Inspector Craddock sat at a scarred oak desk, his notebook open and his brow furrowed with concentration. Miss Jane Marple, granted permission to observe under the guise of offering moral support to the shaken villagers, occupied a chair in the corner, her knitting needles clicking softly as she listened to the crew members' repeated statements. Lucy Eyeless Barrow, ever her shadow, stood near the door, her sharp eyes scanning the faces of Tom Bradley and Ned Foster, the two young men who had manned the balloon alongside Captain Harrow. The room smelled faintly of ink and polished wood, with a trace of damp from the morning's dew seeping through the open window. Tom Bradley, lanky and pale, sat hunched in a chair before Craddock, his fingers twisting a frayed cap as if it were his only anchor. Ned Foster, by contrast, stood with a quiet confidence, his stocky frame relaxed but his eyes alert, meeting the inspector's questions with a steadiness that bordered on defiance. Miss Marple, her expression one of benign interest, noted every gesture, every hesitation, her mind weaving a tapestry from the threads of their words. "Mr. Bradley," Craddock began, his tone firm but not unkind, "let's go over it again. You poured the champagne for Mr. Winthrop and Miss Duval. You're certain the bottle was sealed when you opened it?" Tom's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. "Yes, sir, I'm sure of it," he stammered, his voice cracking like a schoolboy's. "It was a proper cork, tight as anything. I popped it myself, right there in the basket, just after we took off. Mr. Winthrop asked for a toast, see, to celebrate the festival. I poured 4 glasses, one for him, one for Miss Duval, one for me, and one for Ned. Captain Harrow don't drink when he's piloting." Craddock's pencil scratched across his notebook. "And you handed the glass directly to Mr. Winthrop?" "Aye, sir," Tom said, his eyes darting to Ned, then back to the inspector. "I gave it to him straight away. He was standing by the edge of the basket, looking out at the hills. Miss Duval was next to him chatting. I didn't see nothing funny with the glass or the bottle, I swear it." Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze resting on Tom's hands. The boy's nervousness was palpable, his fingers plucking at the cap with a rhythm that betrayed more than simple anxiety. She thought of a village lad who, years ago, had fidgeted just so when questioned about a pilfered apple, his guilt written in the tremble of his hands rather than his words. Tom, she sensed, was not lying outright, but there was something he withheld. A detail, perhaps, that frightened him. Craddock turned to Ned Foster, who stood with his arms crossed, his square jaw set. "And you, Mr. Foster, you were at the burner, you said. Did you see Mr. Bradley pour the champagne?" Ned nodded, his voice even. "I did, sir. I was adjusting the burner. Keeping the flame steady takes focus, especially with the morning winds shifting. But I saw Tom open the bottle and pour. It all looked normal to me. Mr. Winthrop took his glass, raised it, and drank. Miss Duval did the same. Then I went back to the burner. Next thing I knew, Mr. Winthrop was on the floor, gasping." Miss Marple's eyes flicked to Ned's cuff, where she had noticed a faint stain the previous day. In the clearer light of the station, it appeared, darker, almost brownish, with a hint of a bitter scent she couldn't quite place. She made a mental note to inquire about it later, perhaps through Lucy's discreet channels. Ned's calm, she thought, was too polished, like the village carpenter who once claimed ignorance of a tampered gate, his composure masking a deeper involvement. "Did you touch the glasses at any point, Mr. Foster?" Craddock asked, his eyes narrowing. "No, sir," Ned replied, his tone unwavering. "I passed the bottle to Tom, but that was it. My job was the burner and the ropes. I didn't have time to fuss with drinks." Craddock leaned back, his fingers drumming on the desk. "And yet, Mr. Winthrop's glass was poisoned. Cyanide, the lab confirms. One glass, not the others. How do you explain that?" Tom's face paled further, and he shot a glance at Ned, who remained impassive. "I don't know, sir," Tom said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just poured the champagne. I didn't do nothing wrong." Ned shrugged slightly. "Could have been something in the glass before we even got in the basket. They were in the hamper, packed at Meadowbank Hall. Anyone could have got to them." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, but her mind was racing. Ned's suggestion was plausible, yet it felt too convenient. A deflection that shifted blame from the basket to an earlier moment. She recalled a case in St. Mary's Mead, where a poisoned tart had been slipped onto a tea tray before a church fete, the culprit relying on the chaos of preparation to escape notice. The hamper, she thought, was a critical link, one she must explore further. Craddock, sensing the interview had reached its limit, dismissed the two men with a warning to remain available. As they left, Tom's shoulders slumped with relief, while Ned's stride was as steady as ever. Miss Marple watched them go, her thoughts lingering on the contrast between their demeanours. "A nervous boy and a calm one," she murmured to Lucy, who had slipped into the seat beside her. "And yet, Lucy, I wonder which is the more dangerous." Lucy's eyes sparkled with curiosity. "Tom's jumpy enough to make you think he's hiding something, But Ned's too cool, isn't he? Like he's thought it all through. And that stain on his cuff, did you see it?" "I did," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but sharp. "It may be nothing. Oil from the burner, perhaps, but it may be more. We must find out what it is, Lucy, and we must learn who packed that hamper and when." As Craddock gathered his papers, Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. "Inspector," she said, her tone all innocence, "might I ask if the lab has examined the glasses for fingerprints? And the bottle's cork? Any sign it was tampered with?" Craddock's lips twitched, a mix of amusement and exasperation. "You don't miss a thing, do you, Miss Marple?" "The lab found prints on the glasses, Tom's mostly, from pouring, and Winthrop's on his own. Miss Duval's prints were on her glass, but none on Winthrop's. The cork's another matter. There's a scratch, as you noticed, but no clear evidence it was opened before Tom did it. We're still testing for residue." Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away the details. "A scratch," she said, almost to herself. "Such a small thing, yet so suggestive. I recall a bottle of cough syrup in the village, tampered with so cleverly no one suspected until the apothecary noticed a pinprick in the seal." Craddock raised an eyebrow. "You think the poison was in the bottle, not the glass?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that we must consider every possibility. A glass is personal, but a bottle is shared. And yet, only one man died. That is the puzzle." As they left the station, Lucy's mind was already racing ahead. "I'll check with the kitchen staff at Meadowbank Hall," she said. "Someone must know who handled that hamper. And I'll see if I can get a closer look at Ned's cuff. Maybe ask Elsie at the inn if she's noticed anything odd about his clothes." "Do that, my dear," Miss Marple said, her eyes distant but bright. "And keep an ear out for anything about Miss Duval's letter, or Mr. Baxter's movements. The crew's alibis are strong, but alibis, Lucy, are like lace, beautiful until you find the tear." They parted at the village green, Lucy heading toward the inn, and Miss Marple toward her cottage, where the fire would be waiting. As she walked, her thoughts turned to the balloon's cramped basket, the clink of glasses, and the moment when poison met its mark. Tom's nervousness, Ned's calm, the stained cuff, the scratched cork, each was a thread, and she was beginning to see how they might weave together. She thought of a village girl who once hid her theft of a silver spoon by blaming a magpie, her story unravelling only when a neighbour noticed a smudge of polish on her sleeve. Small things, Miss Marple knew, could undo the cleverest plans. "People," she murmured to herself, "are so very careless when they think no one is watching." In her cottage, as the kettle sang and the fire crackled, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting in hand. The crew's alibis were a starting point, but the truth, she felt, lay in the interplay of those who shared that fateful flight, and in the shadows cast by those, like Leonard Baxter, who lingered just out of sight. Chapter 8. The sabotage revealed. The morning mist clung to the fields of St. Mary's Mead, shrouding the village in a delicate veil that softened the outlines of cottages and hedgerows. Miss Jane Marple, undeterred by the damp chill, made her way to Meadowbank Hall, her sturdy shoes tapping lightly on the path. Lucy Eyeless Barrow walked beside her, her face alight with the eagerness of a hound on the scent. They had been summoned by Mr. Higgs, the estate's caretaker, who had telephoned Miss Marple's cottage with news of a discovery that could not wait. "It's the balloon, Miss Marple," he had said, his voice taut with urgency. Something's not right, and I thought you ought to see it." The hall's storage room, where the balloon's equipment remained under police guard, was a cavern of shadows, lit only by a few bare bulbs. The wicker basket stood as they had last seen it, its canopy folded nearby, but Higgs's attention was fixed on a tangle of ropes and a metal contraption attached to the burner. Inspector Craddock was already there, his notebook in hand, his expression a mix of frustration and intrigue. A young constable stood watch, his eyes darting nervously between the visitors and the equipment. "Miss Marple, Miss Isla's Barrow," Craddock said, tipping his hat with a wry smile. "I should have known you'd be here the moment Higgs called. He's found something, and I'll wager you'll have an opinion on it." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her face remained demure. "I'm only here to assist, Inspector. Mr. Higgs, what have you found?" Higgs, his weathered hands gesturing toward the burner, pointed to a thin metal tube that fed fuel to the flame. "It's the fuel line, ma'am," he said, his voice low but intense. "I was checking the equipment, like the inspector asked, and I found this." He indicated a small, almost invisible puncture in the tube, no larger than a pinprick, but enough to cause a slow leak. It's not a tear from wear, mind you. It's clean, deliberate-like. If that balloon had stayed up much longer, the fuel would have run dry and they'd all have come down hard. Lucy's eyes widened. "Sabotage? You mean someone meant to crash the balloon?" Craddock nodded, his jaw tight. "That's what it looks like. The puncture's small, but it's enough to cause trouble. Had Winthrop not collapsed when he did, Captain Harrow might not have landed in time. We could have had a disaster on our hands, not just one death, but 5. Miss Marple's needles, tucked into her bag for the moment, seemed to itch for movement as her mind wove this new thread into the pattern. "Sabotage," she murmured, her voice soft but sharp. "A most dangerous act, and one that suggests a mind willing to risk much. I recall a case in St. Mary's Mead where a farmer cut the reins of a rival's cart, hoping for an accident, but the outcome was far worse than he intended. We must consider who had access to this balloon, and when." Higgs scratched his chin, his eyes narrowing. "The balloon was moored in the field last night, roped off but not locked up tight. Anyone could have got to it after dark. I told you about seeing Mr. Baxter there with his satchel, and that fellow in the tweed cap was about too, though I didn't get a good look at him." Craddock's pencil scratched furiously. "Baxter! Again? He's becoming a fixture in this case. And this tweed cap? Man, nobody seems to know who he is. Miss Marple, any thoughts?" Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the fuel line, her mind picturing the balloon's ascent, the cramped basket, the poisoned glass. "A puncture in the fuel line," she said almost to herself, "is a different kind of crime from poison, Inspector. Poison is personal, precise, aimed at one man. Sabotage is broader, reckless, endangering all. It suggests either desperation or a desire to mask one crime with another. We must ask, was Mr. Winthrop the sole target, or was the entire party meant to suffer?" Lucy, her mind quick as ever, leaned closer. "You think someone tried to kill them all to cover up Winthrop's murder? Or maybe the poison was a backup in case the balloon didn't crash?" "Both are possible," Miss Marple replied, her eyes narrowing. "Or neither. We must not assume too much, Lucy. But Mr. Baxter's presence near the balloon, with a satchel that could hold tools, is suggestive. And Miss Duval, so close to Mr. Winthrop in the basket, had opportunity for the poison. Then there are Tom and Ned, whose duties gave them access to both the equipment and the champagne. Craddock sighed, rubbing his temple. It's a tangle, all right. The lab confirmed cyanide in Winthrop's glass, but no traces in the bottle or the other glasses. Whoever did this was precise, knew exactly which glass would go to Winthrop. But this puncture changes things. It's not just murder now, it's attempted mass murder. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Precision and recklessness, side by side. A curious combination. I recall a village girl who once laced a single cake with a sleeping draught, but also loosened a ladder's bolt to cause a fall. She wanted to ensure her rival's disgrace, but her plans overlapped, and that was her undoing. We must look for such overlaps here. Higgs, still hovering near the burner, added, Captain Harrow checked the balloon himself before the flight, like he always does. He didn't mention no puncture, but it's small, could have been missed in the dark. I only found it because I was looking close after all this talk of poison. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the crew. Tom Bradley's nervousness, Ned Foster's calm, the stain on Ned's cuff, all were pieces of the puzzle, now joined by this new evidence of sabotage. She pictured the balloon's mooring site, the cover of dusk, and Leonard Baxter's shadowy figure with his satchel. The tweed-cap man, too, lingered in her thoughts. An unknown variable in a case already thick with suspicion. "Inspector," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "might you have the fuel line tested for fingerprints, and perhaps the tools in the basket? A puncture so precise would require a steady hand and a sharp instrument." Craddock nodded, jotting down the suggestion. "Already in the works, Miss Marple. We're also checking the satchel Baxter was seen with, though he claims it held only papers. And we're trying to track down this tweed-cap fellow, but he's like a ghost. No one knows him." Lucy, her eyes bright with the thrill of the chase, whispered to Miss Marple, "What about Tom and Ned?" They'd know the balloon inside out, better than Baxter even. Could one of them have made that puncture? "Indeed they could," Miss Marple replied, her voice low. "Tom's debts make him vulnerable, and Ned's ambition could be a spur. But we must also consider Miss Duval's secret, and Mr. Baxter's grudge. The sabotage and the poison may be the work of one hand, or two, working in concert." As they left the storage room, the mist outside had begun to lift, revealing the rolling fields and the distant festival tents, now half dismantled. Miss Marple's thoughts were a tapestry of threads. The poisoned glass, the scratched cork, the stained cuff, and now this deliberate puncture. She thought of a long-ago incident in the village where a sabotaged gate had led to a theft, the two crimes linked by a single motive. The heart of this case, she murmured to Lucy, lies in why someone would risk both poison and sabotage. One is enough for murder, but both suggest a deeper intent. Lucy, her mind racing, nodded. "I'll see if I can find out more about that tweed-cap man. Maybe someone at the festival got a better look. And I'll check with the kitchen staff again. See if anyone saw Baxter or anyone else near the hamper before it was loaded." "Do that, my dear," Miss Marple said, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "And keep an ear out for anything about Captain Harrow. His discipline is admirable, but even the steadiest hands can falter under pressure." As they walked back toward the village, the sun breaking through the mist, Miss Marple felt the mystery's weight settle deeper. The sabotage revealed a new layer of malice, one that endangered not just Winthrop, but everyone in that basket. The truth, she knew, was close, hidden in the interplay of motive and opportunity, waiting for her patient mind to unravel it. Chapter 9. The Confrontation. The village hall of St. Mary's Mead, its sturdy stone walls softened by the glow of late afternoon light, was transformed into a stage for truth's unveiling. Miss Jane Marple had suggested, with her usual tact, that a gathering of the balloon festival's key figures might clarify certain matters. And Inspector Craddock, though sceptical, had agreed. Under the guise of a debriefing to discuss the festival's abrupt end, the suspects, Captain James Harrow, Tom Bradley, Ned Foster, Miss Vivian Duval, and Leonard Baxter, were assembled in the hall's main chamber. The air was thick with tension, the weight of unspoken accusations hanging like a storm cloud over the polished oak table where they sat. Miss Marple, seated near the back with her knitting bag at her side, appeared as unassuming as ever, her needles clicking softly as she worked on a pale blue scarf. Lucy Eyeless Barrow, stationed near the door to observe comings and goings, exchanged a glance with her, a silent acknowledgement of the drama about to unfold. The villagers, permitted to attend as onlookers, filled the benches, their whispers a low hum beneath the creak of floorboards. Lady Bantry, ever eager for a spectacle, sat in the front row, her eyes darting between the suspects with barely concealed excitement. Inspector Craddock stood at the head of the table, his notebook closed for once, his expression one of weary determination. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice carrying authority. "The death of Mr. Clarence Winthrop has cast a shadow over our village, and new evidence suggests it was no accident. We're here to clarify certain points, and I expect your full cooperation." Miss Marple's needles paused, her pale blue eyes scanning the faces before her. Captain Harrow sat erect, his military bearing unshaken, though a flicker of unease crossed his sharp features. Tom Bradley, his hands twisting in his lap, looked as if he might bolt at any moment. Ned Foster, calm as ever, leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on Craddock with a steadiness that bordered on defiance. Miss Vivian Duval, her elegance undimmed by the grim occasion, sat with her hands folded, her gaze guarded but composed. Leonard Baxter, his broad shoulders filling his tailored coat, exuded a restless energy, his fingers drumming faintly on the table. Craddock began with Harrow, his tone measured. "Captain, you've maintained the flight was routine until Mr. Winthrop's collapse, but we found a puncture in the balloon's fuel line, a deliberate act of sabotage. Did you notice anything amiss during your pre-flight checks?" Harrow's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "Nothing, Inspector. I inspected the balloon myself, as I always do. The fuel line was intact, or so it appeared, a puncture that small could easily be missed in the dim light of dawn." Miss Marple noted the precision of his words, the way he avoided elaboration. She thought of a village blacksmith who once swore his tools were untouched, only to be betrayed by a single misplaced hammer. "Discipline," she murmured to Lucy, "can be a shield, but it does not always conceal." Craddock turned to Tom Bradley, whose face paled under the scrutiny. "Mr. Bradley, you were responsible for the equipment, including the picnic hamper. You poured the champagne, yet Mr. Winthrop's glass alone contained cyanide. Can you explain that?" Tom's voice cracked, his cap now a crumpled wreck in his hands. "I don't know, sir. I swear the bottle was sealed when I opened it. I poured the glasses same as always. One for Mr. Winthrop, one for Miss Duval, one for me, One for Ned. I didn't touch his glass after I handed it to him. I was busy with the ropes." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed at the mention of the glasses. Tom's nervousness was genuine, she thought, but whether it stemmed from guilt or fear of blame, she could not yet say. She recalled a young maid in St. Mary's Mead who had trembled just so when questioned about a stolen brooch, only to reveal she'd seen another's theft, but feared to speak. Ned Foster was next, his calm unshaken even under Craddock's probing gaze. "Mr. Foster, you were at the burner during the critical moment. You claim you saw nothing, but we found a stain on your cuff. Possibly oil, possibly something else. Care to explain?" Ned's expression flickered, a brief shadow crossing his face before he recovered. "Oil, Inspector. The burner's a messy job. I was adjusting the flame, keeping the balloon steady. I didn't see Mr. Winthrop's glass or what happened to it. My focus was on my work." Miss Marple's needles slowed. The stain, she thought, was a detail that nagged at her, like the faint mark on a gardener's glove that had once led to a poisoner's undoing. Ned's calm was too perfect, too practiced, and she made a mental note to press Craddock to test the cuff further. Miss Duval, when questioned, maintained her poise, though her voice held a faint tremor. "Miss Duval," Craddock said, "you were closest to Mr. Winthrop during the flight. You handled his glass before takeoff, did you not? And your connection to him, more than just an old friend, I gather, based on a letter from his company found in your possession." Miss Duval's eyes widened, but she recovered quickly, her hands tightening on her handbag. "I don't know what you mean, Inspector. Yes, I took a glass from the hamper, as did Mr. Winthrop, but I didn't touch his after that. As for the letter, it was a business matter, long resolved. Clarence and I had no quarrel." Miss Marple's lips pursed. The letter, as Lucy had discovered, suggested a deeper tie, a business venture gone sour, perhaps. She thought of a village widow who had hidden a financial dispute behind claims of friendship. Her true motives revealed only by a careless word. Miss Duval's reticence was a thread that begged to be pulled. Finally, Craddock turned to Leonard Baxter, whose drumming fingers stilled as the room's attention shifted to him. "Mr. Baxter," Craddock said, his tone sharp, "you were seen near the balloon the night before the flight, carrying a satchel. You lost a major contract to Winthrop's company, and witnesses heard you speak of making things right. Care to explain your presence and your intentions?" Baxter's face reddened, his voice rising in protest. "I was admiring the balloons, nothing more. Yes, Winthrop outbid me, but that's business. I had no reason to harm him. My satchel held papers, contracts, nothing else. I know nothing about any puncture or poison." Miss Marple's needles stopped entirely, her eyes fixed on Baxter's flushed face. His denial was vehement, but too quick, too loud, like the bluster of a village merchant caught with short weights. She leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but cutting through the room's tension. "Mr. Baxter," she said, "you were seen by Mr. Higgs near the balloon, with a satchel that could hold tools. And Miss Duval, you took Mr. Winthrop's glass from the hamper, did you not? A small act, but so significant in such a confined space." Baxter's mouth opened, then closed, his eyes darting to the others. Miss Duval paled, her composure cracking for the first time. Tom Bradley shrank further into his chair, while Ned Foster's calm remained, though his fingers twitched slightly. Captain Harrow, silent until now, cleared his throat. "Miss Marple," he said. "I assure you, my crew and I followed protocol. The balloon was secure, or so I believed." Miss Marple smiled, her expression all kindness, but her words precise. "Of course, Captain, but protocols can be circumvented by those with intent. A puncture in the fuel line, a poisoned glass, these are not accidents, but acts of will, and will, I find, is often born of grievance." The room fell silent, the villagers leaning forward, sensing the climax of the moment. Craddock, catching Miss Marple's drift, pressed on. "We have evidence," he said, "that the fuel line was tampered with, and the cyanide was in Mr. Winthrop's glass alone. Someone in this room, or someone who had access to that balloon, knew exactly what they were doing. If anyone has anything to add, now is the time." The silence stretched, taut as a wire. Miss Marple's eyes moved from one face to another, reading the flickers of fear, defiance, and calculation. Baxter's bluster, she thought, hid a deeper truth. Miss Duval's evasion pointed to a past betrayal. Tom's nerves and Ned's calm were pieces of a puzzle still incomplete. But the puncture, the poison, and the satchel formed a pattern she could almost grasp. "Inspector," she said at last, her voice gentle but firm, "might I suggest a closer look at Mr. Baxter's satchel? And perhaps a test of Mr. Foster's cuff? Small things, you know, often tell the largest tales." Craddock nodded, his eyes narrowing. "We'll do that, Miss Marple, and I'll expect you all to remain in the village until we've sorted this out." As the gathering dispersed, the suspects filing out with varying degrees of unease, Lucy whispered to Miss Marple, "You've stirred them up, haven't you? Baxter looked ready to bolt, and Miss Duval's practically shaking." Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. People reveal themselves when pressed, Lucy. "And now I think we are very close to the truth." As they stepped into the fading light, the village hall behind them, Miss Marple felt the threads of the mystery tightening. The confrontation had laid bare the suspects' masks, and soon she knew the final piece would fall into place. Chapter 10. The motive unravelled. The evening air in St. Mary's Mead carried a crisp edge, the stars beginning to pierce the indigo sky as Miss Jane Marple sat by her cottage fireplace, her knitting needles idle for once. The confrontation at the village hall had set the stage for truth to emerge. And now, with the suspects' masks beginning to slip, she felt the mystery of Clarence Winthrop's death drawing toward its resolution. Lucy Eylis Barrow, perched on a cushioned stool, her notebook open, recounted the latest findings from her discreet inquiries around the village. The fire's glow cast flickering shadows on the walls, mirroring the shifting patterns in Miss Marple's mind, as she wove together the threads of poison, sabotage, and hidden grudges. "Lucy, my dear," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but precise, "you've done splendidly with your investigations. Tell me again what you learned about Mr. Baxter's movements and that letter to Miss Duval." Lucy's eyes sparkled with the thrill of the chase. "I spoke to the innkeeper's boy, young Peter, who was sweeping the yard the night before the balloon ride. He saw Baxter near the festival field, not just with a satchel, but fiddling with something near Captain Harrow's balloon. Peter thought he was adjusting a rope, but it was dark and he couldn't be sure. As for Miss Duval, I tracked down a maid at the Golden Boar who overheard her on the telephone a week ago, talking about a debt owed by Winthrop. The maid didn't catch much, but Miss Duval sounded angry, said something about never forgiving him." Miss Marple's lips pursed, her eyes narrowing as she considered this new intelligence. A debt, you say? And Mr. Baxter near the balloon, tampering perhaps. These are significant, Lucy. I recall a case in St. Mary's Mead where a grocer, wronged in a business deal, tampered with a rival's delivery cart out of spite. The act was small, but the intent was deadly. We're close, I think, to understanding Mr. Winthrop's fate. The pieces were falling into place. The poisoned glass, the scratched cork, the puncture in the fuel line, Ned Foster's stained cuff, Miss Duval's guarded secret, and Leonard Baxter's simmering resentment. Miss Marple's mind, as sharp as the needles now resting in her lap, turned to the confrontation at the village hall, where Baxter's bluster and Miss Duval's pallor had spoken volumes. The sabotage of the balloon suggested a reckless plan to endanger all aboard, while the cyanide in Winthrop's glass pointed to a precise, personal vendetta. But how did they connect, and who held the thread that bound them? A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Inspector Craddock entered, his face weary but alert, his notebook tucked under his arm. "Miss Marple," he said, settling into a chair with a sigh. "You've stirred the pot, haven't you?" That confrontation shook them up, and we've got new evidence. The lab tested Ned Foster's cuff. Traces of cyanide, faint but unmistakable, and Baxter's satchel, which he finally let us search, held a small awl, the kind that could make a puncture like the one in What's That fuel line. No fingerprints on the awl, mind you. He's too clever for that. But it's damning. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Cyanide on Ned's cuff, and an awl in Mr. Baxter's possession. Most illuminating, Inspector. And what of the champagne bottle's cork? Any further findings? Craddock nodded, flipping open his notebook. The scratch on the cork wasn't random. The lab says it's consistent with a needle or syringe, likely used to inject the cyanide into the bottle before it was resealed. The seal itself was tampered with, carefully done, but not perfect. Someone knew what they were doing. Lucy leaned forward, her voice eager. So the poison was in the bottle, not the glass. But Dr. Haydock said only Winthrop's glass had cyanide. Exactly, Craddock said, rubbing his temple. The bottle was clean when we tested it, but the cork tells a different story. Whoever did this injected the poison, poured Winthrop's glass first, and let the others drink safely. It's clever, too clever for a spur-of-the-moment act. Miss Marple's mind raced, the pattern crystallizing. She pictured the balloon's basket, the clink of glasses, the moment of distraction as Tom poured. Ned adjusted the burner, and Miss Duval chatted with Winthrop. But it was Baxter's shadow that loomed largest now. The rival with a motive, seen near the balloon, his satchel holding a tool that matched the sabotage. She thought of a village carpenter who once sabotaged a rival's workbench, his anger spilling over into an act that endangered more than his target. Baxter, she suspected, had planned a double blow, a crash to mask a murder, and poison to ensure Winthrop's death. "Inspector," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "let us consider Mr. Baxter's motive. He lost a contract to Winthrop, a blow to his pride and his purse. Such losses breed bitterness, and bitterness can lead to desperate acts. I believe he tampered with the fuel line, hoping for a crash that would be blamed on mechanical failure. But when that seemed uncertain, balloons, after all, are unpredictable, he took a more direct path. The cyanide, injected into the bottle before the flight, was meant for Winthrop alone." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "You're saying Baxter poisoned the bottle and sabotaged the balloon? That's a lot of risk for one man." "Risk, yes," Miss Marple replied, "but not beyond a man driven by hatred." The puncture was a fallback, a way to ensure chaos if the poison failed. He knew Tom would pour the glasses, and that Winthrop, as the guest of honour, would drink first. The scratch on the cork, the awl in his satchel, these point to a man who planned carefully but acted boldly. Lucy frowned, her notebook forgotten. "What about Ned's cuff? How does that fit?" Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. "Ned's cuff is a puzzle, Lucy." The cyanide suggests he handled the poison, perhaps unknowingly. He was at the burner, but burners require tools, and tools can be shared. Suppose Baxter, in his tampering, left a trace of cyanide on a tool Ned later used? Or suppose Ned saw more than he admits, and his calm is a mask for complicity. We must not rule him out, but I suspect he is a bystander, caught in another's web. Craddock scribbled a note, his brow furrowed. "And Miss Duval. Her letter, her evasions, she's hiding something, but is it murder?" Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Miss Duval, I think, is a woman wronged, but not a killer. Her letter, her anger, they point to a business betrayal, a loss tied to Winthrop's success. She was close to him in the basket, yes, but her motive lacks the ferocity of Baxter's. She may have wished him ill, but I doubt she acted. Her presence, however, was a convenient distraction for the true killer." The fire crackled, casting a warm glow over the room, as Miss Marple's theory took shape. Baxter, she believed, had orchestrated both the sabotage and the poison, his hatred for Winthrop driving him to ensure no chance of survival. The puncture in the fuel line was a reckless act, meant to obscure the murder as an accident, while the cyanide was a guarantee of Winthrop's death. Tom's nervousness, Ned's stained cuff, and Miss Duval's secret were threads in his tapestry, but Baxter was the weaver. "Inspector," she said at last, "I suggest you question Mr. Baxter again, focusing on his movements the night before the flight. The awl, the satchel, the scratch on the cork, these are his signatures. And perhaps young Peter, the innkeeper's boy, can confirm what he saw near the balloon." Craddock nodded, his expression one of grudging admiration. "You've got a knack for this, Miss Marple. I'll bring Baxter in tomorrow, and we'll test that tool for cyanide traces. If you're right, we've got our man." Lucy grinned, her eyes bright. "You've done it again, haven't you? I knew you were close at the Hall." Miss Marple's smile was modest. "I have only followed the threads, my dear, but they are strong ones, and they lead to Mr. Baxter. His motive, his rivalry, his loss, has unravelled him." As Craddock took his leave, promising to keep her informed, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, the needles resuming their rhythm. The motive was clear, the pattern nearly complete. But a small doubt lingered, like a loose stitch in her work. Ned's cuff, Miss Duval's letter, were they truly incidental, or did they hint at a deeper complexity? She would wait, as she always did, for the final piece to fall into place. "Lucy," she said, her voice soft as the fire's glow, "tomorrow, keep an eye on Ned Foster. His calm is a puzzle, and puzzles, you know, often hide the last clue." Lucy nodded, her enthusiasm undimmed. "I'm on it. You're going to catch him, aren't you?" "Baxter, I mean." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "I only point the way, my dear. The truth catches itself." Chapter 11. The Confession. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of the St. Mary's Mead police station, casting delicate shadows across the interview room. where Inspector Craddock sat, his face a mask of resolute determination. The room, with its faded wallpaper and sturdy oak table, had seen many a petty dispute, but today it held the weight of a murder's resolution. Miss Jane Marple, permitted to observe from her usual corner, sat with her knitting bag at her side, her needles moving with their familiar, soothing rhythm. Lucy Iles Barrow, stationed near the door, her notebook discreetly tucked into her pocket, watched with the keen alertness of a hawk. The air was thick with anticipation, for Leonard Baxter, the man whose shadow had loomed over the case, had been summoned for a final reckoning. Craddock had acted swiftly on Miss Marple's suggestion, bringing Baxter in for questioning armed with new evidence. The awl from his satchel, now confirmed to bear traces of the same metal alloy as the balloon's fuel line. The testimony of young Peter, the innkeeper's boy, who had seen Baxter tampering near the balloon, and the scratched cork, its syringe mark pointing to a deliberate act of poisoning. The case, once a tangle of threads, was now a tightly woven net, and Miss Marple felt the truth poised to break free. Baxter entered the room, his broad shoulders filling the doorway, but the confidence that had marked him at the village hall was fraying. His face, flushed with defiance, bore the strain of a man cornered. He sat heavily, his hands gripping the table's edge, and fixed Craddock with a glare that held more bravado than conviction. "This is absurd, Inspector," he began, his voice loud but unsteady. "I've told you, I had nothing to do with Winthrop's death. Papers? That's all I had in my satchel. Business papers." Craddock's expression remained impassive, his notebook open before him. "Mr. Baxter," he said, his tone measured but unyielding, "we have evidence that suggests otherwise. An awl from your satchel matches the puncture in the balloon's fuel line, a deliberate act of sabotage that could have killed everyone aboard. Young Peter saw you near the balloon that night, handling something near the basket, and the champagne bottle's cork shows signs of tampering, consistent with a syringe used to inject cyanide. You were heard speaking of making things right with Winthrop, a man who cost you a lucrative contract. Care to explain?" Baxter's eyes darted to the door, then back to Craddock, his fingers tightening on the table. "I was looking at the balloons, nothing more. I'm a businessman, not a mechanic. And I never touched that bottle. I wasn't even in the basket." Miss Marple's needles paused, her pale blue eyes fixed on Baxter's flushed face. His denial was fierce, but there was a crack in his voice, a tremor that reminded her of a village merchant who, years ago, had protested innocence over a forged ledger until the weight of evidence broke him. She leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but cutting through the tension. "Mr. Baxter," she said, "you were seen by Mr. Higgs and young Peter near the balloon with a satchel that held an awl. Your rivalry with Mr. Winthrop was no secret. His victory in that contract cost you dearly, did it not? A man in your position, with pride and fortune at stake, might act rashly to reclaim what was lost." Baxter's gaze snapped to her, his eyes narrowing. "You're that old lady from the hall, aren't you? Spinning tales out of nothing. I didn't poison anyone, and I didn't touch that fuel line." Craddock leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "Then explain the awl, Mr. Baxter, and the scratch on the cork, which matches a syringe's mark, and Peter's testimony, placing you at the balloon with something in your hand. You spoke of Winthrop with anger. Witnesses heard you at the inn. The evidence points to you, and it's a heavy weight." Baxter's bravado faltered, his shoulders slumping as the room's silence pressed against him. Miss Marple watched, her mind tracing the pattern she had woven. The poisoned glass, the sabotaged fuel line, the satchel, the grudge. She thought of a case in St. Mary's Mead where a spurned suitor had tampered with a rival's horse, his anger blinding him to the consequences. Baxter's hatred, she believed, had driven him to a double act, sabotage to mask murder, and poison to ensure Winthrop's death. "Mr. Baxter," she said gently, her voice like a breeze through the room's tension. "Hatred is a heavy burden. You lost much to Mr. Winthrop, and that loss festered. The fuel line was your first plan, was it not? A crash, blamed on mechanical failure to rid you of your rival. But balloons are unpredictable, and you could not be sure. So you turned to poison, a surer method, injected into the bottle before the flight, knowing Tom Bradley would pour Winthrop's glass first." Baxter's face drained of colour, his hands trembling now. "That's nonsense," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. I didn't." Craddock pressed the advantage, sliding a photograph of the awl across the table. "This was in your satchel, Mr. Baxter, and the lab confirms it matches the puncture. We've got fingerprints on the champagne bottle. Yours, from when you were admiring it in the kitchen, perhaps. And Peter's statement places you at the scene. You can't talk your way out of this." The room seemed to close in, the weight of evidence crushing Baxter's defiance. He buried his face in his hands, his voice breaking. "Winthrop ruined me," he spat, the words spilling out like a dam bursting. "That contract was mine. Years of work, my company's future, gone because he played dirty. I wanted him to pay, yes, but I didn't mean. I only meant to scare him, to make him sweat. The fuel line, I thought it'd force a landing, nothing more. But when I saw that bottle in the kitchen, I had the cyanide from an old factory batch. I didn't think it through. I injected it, resealed the cork. I just wanted him gone." Miss Marple's niddles resumed their rhythm, a quiet counterpoint to Baxter's confession. She had seen it coming, the moment his bluster gave way to despair. It was like the village carpenter who confessed to sabotaging a rival's tools, his anger unravelling under the weight of truth. Baxter's motive, rivalry, loss, and wounded pride, had driven him to a desperate act, one that endangered all but claimed only Winthrop. Craddock signalled to the constable, who stepped forward with handcuffs. "Leonard Baxter," he said, his voice formal, "you're under arrest for the murder of Clarence Winthrop and the attempted endangerment of others. You'll come with us." As Baxter was led away, his head bowed, the room seemed to exhale. Lucy, her eyes wide, whispered to Miss Marple, "You did it. You knew it was him all along, didn't you?" Miss Marple's smile was modest, her eyes fixed on the fire's glow. "I only followed the threads, my dear. Mr. Baxter's hatred was a bright one, burning through his caution. The awl, the cork, his words at the inn, they wove the pattern, and he could not escape it." Craddock, gathering his papers, paused to nod at her. "You've got a gift, Miss Marple. I'd have got there eventually, but you tied it up neatly. Ned's cuff, though, cyanide traces. How do you explain that?" Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. "A trace, perhaps, from a tool Baxter used, left in the basket for Ned to handle. Or perhaps Ned saw more than he admitted and kept silent out of fear. He is ambitious, Inspector, but I think not a killer. You might ask him gently what he noticed that day." Craddock nodded, making a note. "I will. And Miss Duval's letter? Just a red herring?" "A wound, but not a fatal one," Miss Marple replied. "Her grudge was real, but her hands, I believe, are clean. People's secrets, Inspector, often cloud the truth, but they rarely change it." As they left the station, the village settling into its evening calm, Miss Marple felt the case's weight lift. Baxter's confession had closed the net, but the mystery's echoes lingered. Ned's silence, Miss Duval's letter, Tom's nerves. They were threads she would leave to Craddock, for her work was done. The truth, as always, had caught itself. "Lucy," she said as they walked toward her cottage, "you've been invaluable. But now I think we deserve a quiet cup of tea." Lucy grinned, her enthusiasm undimmed. "And a scone, I hope. You've earned it, Miss Marple." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Perhaps, my dear, perhaps." Chapter 12. The quiet return. The evening settled over St. Mary's Mead with a gentle hush, the village reclaiming its familiar calm after the storm of Clarence Winthrop's murder. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cosy sitting room, the fire casting a warm glow across the familiar clutter of her cottage. Chintz curtains, a well-worn armchair, and the small table where her knitting lay. Now nearly a completed scarf, the balloon festival, its vibrant silks and bustling crowds, had faded into memory, leaving the village to its quiet rhythms. Outside, the last balloons rose in the distance, their colours muted against the twilight sky. A final nod to a celebration marred by tragedy. Lucy Eylis-Barrow, her cheeks flushed from the evening chill, burst through the door with her usual energy, a tray of tea and scones in hand. "I thought you'd want a proper tea after all that," she said, setting the tray down with a flourish. "The village is still buzzing about Baxter's arrest, but it's settling down. You did it, Miss Marple. Solved it like you always do. I want to know how you knew it was him." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled as she poured the tea, her movements precise despite the faint tremor of age. "My dear Lucy," she said, her voice soft as the fire's crackle, "I didn't know, not at first. I only watched and listened, as I always do. People, you see, are much the same, whether in a village or a balloon. They act on greed, fear, or anger, and those passions leave traces, like footprints in a garden bed. Mr. Baxter's anger was the brightest trace of all." Lucy settled into a chair, her notebook abandoned for once, her eyes fixed on Miss Marple. "But there were so many threads. Ned's cuff, Miss Duval's letter, Tom's nerves. How did you sort them out?" Miss Marple sipped her tea, her gaze drifting to the fire. "It's rather like knitting, Lucy. Each thread seems separate at first, but when you follow them, they form a pattern. Mr. Baxter's rivalry with Mr. Winthrop was the key. His loss of that contract, his wounded pride. It was like a case in St. Mary's Mead years ago, when a grocer tampered with a rival's scales out of spite. Baxter's sabotage of the fuel line was his first plan, meant to cause a crash that would be blamed on mischance. But he was a man who left nothing to chance, so he added the cyanide, injected into the bottle's cork, ensuring Winthrop's death." Lucy frowned, buttering a scone. "And Ned's cuff?" "That threw me. I thought he might be involved." Miss Marple's lips pursed, a faint smile playing at their corners. A puzzle, wasn't it? The cyanide on Ned's cuff was likely a trace from a tool Baxter used, left in the basket for Ned to handle during his work at the burner. Ned is ambitious, Lucy, but not, I think, a killer. His calm was his shield, much like a village lad I once knew who stayed silent about a theft he'd witnessed, fearing blame. "Aye, Suspect Ned saw something, perhaps Baxter's tampering, but kept quiet to protect his dreams of a balloon business. "And Miss Duval?" Lucy asked, leaning forward. "That letter, her evasions, she seemed so suspicious." "Miss Duval," Miss Marple said, setting her teacup down, "was a woman wronged, but not a murderer. Her letter, as you discovered, pointed to a business betrayal, a venture with Winthrop that cost her dearly. Her anger was real, but it was old, like a wound that scarred over. She was in the basket, close to Winthrop, but her role, I believe, was to distract unwittingly aiding Baxter's plan. People's secrets, Lucy, often cloud a case, but they rarely change its heart." Lucy grinned, her eyes bright. "You saw through it all, the cork Baxter's bluster. I thought Tom might crack under pressure. He was so nervous." Miss Marple's smile deepened. "Poor Tom. His nerves were those of youth, caught in a moment too large for him. His debts made him vulnerable, but they were a distraction, like the chatter at a church fete that masks a pickpocket's work. Baxter used the chaos of the flight, Tom's ropes, Ned's burner, Miss Duval's conversation, to slip the poison into play. It was bold, but his hatred was bolder." The fire crackled, filling the silence as Lucy nibbled her scone, her mind still racing. And Captain Harrow, he seemed so above it all. "Captain Harrow," Miss Marple said, her voice thoughtful, "is a man of discipline, and discipline can blind one to small things. He missed the puncture, as he admitted, and his focus on the balloon left no room for suspicion. He reminds me of a village schoolmaster who once overlooked a prank because he was too busy with his ledgers. Innocence, Lucy, is sometimes just a lack of attention." Lucy laughed, shaking her head. "You make it sound so simple, but it's not, is it? All those clues, the satchel, the puncture, the letter, and you tied them together like a bow." Miss Marple's eyes softened, her needles resuming their rhythm. "It's never simple, my dear, but it's always human. People act for reasons, love, hate, greed, and those reasons leave marks. I only look for them, as I did in the village when a poisoned pie revealed a jealous heart. Mr. Baxter's marks were clear. The awl, the cork, his words at the inn. They told the story of a man consumed by rivalry." Outside, the last balloon drifted upward, a solitary splash of colour against the darkening sky. Miss Marple watched it through the window, her thoughts settling like the village itself. The case was closed, Baxter's confession securing justice, but the echoes of human frailty lingered. Ned's silence, Miss Duval's secret, Tom's fear, they were reminders of the complexities that even a solved mystery could not fully unravel. "Lucy," she said at last, "you've been a treasure, as always. Your sharp eyes and quick tongue found what I could not. But now I think we've earned a rest." Lucy grinned, pouring another cup of tea. "Rest? You'll be on to the next mystery before the week's out, I'll bet." Miss Marple's laugh was soft, like the rustle of leaves. "Perhaps, my dear, but for now the village is quiet, and that is enough." As they sipped their tea, the fire's warmth wrapping them in comfort, Miss Marple's mind rested on the truth she had uncovered. The fatal balloon ride, with its poison and sabotage, was a tale of human passion laid bare. And in St. Mary's Mead, where secrets bloomed like roses, she knew there would always be another tale, waiting for her patient, unerring hand to unravel it.